Not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, one begins again. James Baldwin from his final novel, Just Above My Head. Last week at this time, I was feeling frustrated and discouraged, but my hopefulness lingered beneath the surface and came to light when someone shared that this Baldwin quote, which is also the title of Eddie Glaud's most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for its own. It's easy to become overwhelmed in the context of racial justice work. And so we constantly remind ourselves that this is an ongoing project, and that each day we begin again. Good morning, everybody. Today's breakfast is a reimagining of the OIE informational breakfast that had traditionally been hosted just with our partners in the health system. Today, instead, we have a virtual platform, and so this is one of the opportunities that virtual experiences have offer for us to have a much larger audience with people from across the university and the health system. As we planned the breakfast, we wanted to develop a theme that we thought would resonate, and given Duke's ambitious goals around anti-racism and the timing of this breakfast, 9 days after an historic presidential election, we landed on our theme, how the pandemic has magnified the challenges of achieving racial equity in a post-election America. As we listen to presenters share 3 exciting and impactful initiatives that reflect creativity and commitment to integrating and elevating the importance of anti-racism in our work and learning, as we hear from our 3 illustrious panelists, Guy Charles, professor in the law school and MSNBC contributor, Jane Ifekwinigwe, associate director of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation and a scholar in genomics, and Viviana Bianchi Martinez, professor in family medicine. I want to pose some questions for you in the spirit of how we can all contribute as individuals to creating a more racially equitable Duke. What messages from today will help me to sustain my efforts towards personal and institutional transformation? How can I help foster deep impact of racial equity work into the threads of our Duke community so that individuals experience change? And what are ways that I can help to secure broad-based support and buy-in for anti-racism efforts? Today, I feel hopeful, and dare I say even a bit celebratory, as we contemplate the future at Duke, and as we continue to reckon with how we dismantle structures of racial inequality. I'm excited about this morning. I look forward to being able to have a cup of coffee with you in person, hopefully someday soon. And I also want to take a minute to recognize and thank my OIE staff partners who were essential to the planning of this breakfast. Dr. Robert Crouch, who's the Director for Diversity Inclusion, Pam Bivens, Assistant Director for Diversity Inclusion, and Maria Marino, Program Coordinator for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and also Selden Smith, our technical support. Finally, I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. So just as a reminder, this session is being recorded and is being streamed on YouTube, and we will post the recording on our website after the program. There will not be any breaks in this program, and the chat box is not available, but we do have the Q&A function available for questions to presenters and panelists. So without further ado, I'll now turn the floor over to Dr. Crouch.
Okay, good morning. Okay. Welcome to everyone to OIE's 8th annual information breakfast. Each year during the breakfast, various groups and entities from around the Duke community share their efforts in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay. Our community recognizes that if we want to achieve our goal of dismantling structures of inequality at Duke, it will require a persistent focus and constant attention on how we can integrate racial equity, diversity, and inclusion into our work and learning through unique and reimagined programs and activities. You will hear about some of those efforts today. We were thrilled to receive a number of outstanding entries which covered Duke University and health system and the larger community. Today, we will highlight 3 distinct initiatives, but all of the entries will be available for review on the OIE website. We thank you for your submissions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce 3 organizations that will provide an overview of their respective initiatives. Each presenter will have 5 minutes to share his or her initiative. At the conclusion of the presentations, there will be a 7-minute Q&A or question and answer period, at which time you will have an opportunity to ask the respective presenters about their initiatives. At this time, I want to introduce our first presenters. Our first presenters are LaShonda Kendall and Laura Webb with the Office of Informational Technology, the Diversity IT program or group. So it is my pleasure to introduce LaShonda and Laura at this time.
Good morning. Hope y'all are all doing well on this bright early morning, even though there's no sunshine. My name is LaShonda Kendall. I am the IT project manager at Alumni Affairs and co-chair of Diversify IT.
Good morning. My name is Laura Webb. I am also a project manager in the Office of Information Technology, and I'm also a co-chair of Diversify IT. Diversify IT is a community of IT professionals across the university and hospital. Many of our IT professionals are in isolated roles without immediate IT professionals in their working groups. So we came together in 2014 to provide belonging and identity within our IT community. We have a committee that are elected and nominated into their positions. We have 12 of us. They're all staff. We have IT leaders in various units that are also participatory in our function. We do programming, community engagement, data and research, and communication. We're mainly run by a mailing list that has been our backbone for years. It's the way we take the pulse of our community. We celebrate, we share stories, we commiserate, and we congratulate. It's a great place of connection. And in recent years, we've used that listserv to provide great ideas for programming. We focused on different identities throughout the IT community and had a varied form of those programming. We've had informal relationship building community lunches, and we've had really focused training, educational lectures, and various things that we participated in. So this summer, we addressed race and racism directly. We first attended the Living While Black Symposium that the university hosted, and then we provided supplemental programming around it as it fell naturally into the regular function of what we do. But we found that we couldn't hold all that needed to be shared and held together in our community. We needed a bigger container. We needed more. So we created the Living IT While Black series. And in July, we started with something called the Open Mic. We invited colleagues to share their stories, white and Black. We gave them an open mic for 10 minutes to speak uninterrupted. Many of those speakers spoke live. Some of them spoke anonymously, shared their stories in advance. And then we as a community opened up for discussion to ask questions of the speaker and of each other. We had great participation from our IT leaders who were really engaged in hearing more from our stories.
As a result of the open mic series, lots of different conversations started amongst colleagues. We started conversations with leaders. Leaders started conversations across the university. This whole effort broke the silence and helped to start the healing of pain that we started to really acknowledge. I don't want to say feel, but we acknowledged it and said it out loud in May. Black people needed to feel safe. Black people needed to be heard, and they needed to know that there is space for them here at Duke. So the next piece of the series is called the sidebar, and it's kind of a walkthrough or an example between Black and white colleagues who talk about race. Whether they know each other for a really long time or really just getting to know each other and having to work together, race is going to be something that needs to be talked about. It's important to recognize. So we're giving everyone examples of how to start those conversations in case you just don't know, because it's not normal for us to talk about race. This is not going away. It's not a fad. It's not a moment. It's a movement. So we have to be prepared. We have to educate ourselves as much as possible. We at Diversify IT are trying to make sure that we're working towards President Price's call for action as far as being an anti-race institution. After we did the open mic, we gave feedback and an action plan to our leaders so that we can also make sure that their voice is heard as it relates to how we move forward. If you want more information, we do have a website at diversifyit.duke.edu. The action plan is there if you also want to check that out, and also join our listserv. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, LaShonda and Laura, for that great effort, sharing that great effort. Our next presenter is Francesca Santos, Assistant Director with the University Center Activities and Events, the DuArts BIPOC Accountability Project. So let's welcome Francesca, and we go.
Hi, y'all. My name is Francesca Santos. I'm the Assistant Director for Arts and Media for the Student Engagement Involvement Team. And I would like to start us off with a simple land acknowledgement. The land we sit on today and walk every day at Duke are historical lands that belong to the peoples who worked and nurtured the area long before European expansion. These are the ancestral lands of the Lumbee, the Sakoni, the Eno, the Sissequa, the Shakori, and many lost tribes. Acknowledging whose lands we are on moves beyond formality's sake. This serves as an active message that we recognize, see, listen, and respect Native and Indigenous peoples, those that are here with us today and those beyond Duke's community. It means respecting Indigenous history past and present and honoring Indigenous ways of knowing. Regardless of how you got here today, I encourage and push you to think of what it means to cultivate mutual aid, dialogue, and learning together with Indigenous communities. I encourage you to question and rebuke illegitimate authority and to interrogate the stories that were curated for you, because by knowing your history, you get to know yourself and how to conduct yourself as an uninvited guest. As we go through the program and as we return to campus, we must remember that we are able to exist in these spaces at the expense of the First Peoples of this land. On our slides, you'll notice that there's a QR code. DuArts is always seeking feedback and collaborative and intentional partnerships. So if you're interested, feel free to drop us your email and we will follow up. DuArts is our arts umbrella organization that advocates and supports more than 80 student arts organizations on campus. These students, both undergraduate and graduate students, are responsible for creating access and opportunities for students and artists on campus, and they work with administration to make sure that the student art voice is heard. Taking us back to Memorial Day 2020 and a couple of weeks that followed, our executive team, many for the first time grappling with racism and sexism and misogynoir, came to us with the intention of releasing a statement of support, standing against the injustices that were happening in BIPOC communities. I have the pleasure of advising this group with Sarah Neff, whose background is in trauma-informed spaces, and with my own knowledge of academic safe spaces, we knew that this was complicated. We knew that releasing a statement without action is simply lip service, and we were not comfortable in supporting an empty statement. So we had that conversation with our students. What actions are you actually planning to take to support the statement? How are you examining the group's complicity with racism and sexism? How are we finding the lane from which to operate so that we are not taking power or seats at the table from BIPOC folks? And honestly, how are we going to fund this initiative when we don't get consistent yearly funding? And Sarah and I didn't have answers. And unsurprisingly, our students didn't have answers. So we started meeting over the summer. We made group chats, we called, we texted, we FaceTimed, we Zoomed. And we just dug into it. And luckily our students are really thoughtful and really kind. And from all of those meetings and all of those sessions, the BIPOC Accountability Project was born. So it comes in 4 components, A, C, E, D. The first is an accountability survey. It's a survey that we send out to all student arts groups on campus asking, did you make a statement? Are you supporting and living that statement? And do you need support living and breathing that statement? We're trying to gain a better understanding of how student organizations are fulfilling that commitment and where they need support. In its second launch, we are hoping to send it to all student organizations on campus. We're super excited. The second is C for collaborative initiative. We are partnering with Duke University Union and Duke Partnership for Service for a series called Arts as Social Justice. This series aims to build connections for students and artists on campus to ethically and safely engage in difficult conversations around arts and equity and ability and intersectionality. E is for examination. We're taking an introspective look at what we're doing. We know that we are complicit in systems of oppression, and we are looking at our recruitment practices. We're looking at our election procedures. We're redefining our marketing and advertising to make sure that folks have both access to our program and access to our organization. D is for discussion. This is not a topic that you talk about once and you put on a shelf and never pick back up. So we have weekly discussions with our executive team. Each executive member is responsible for finding a topic within arts and social justice and bringing it to us and letting us discuss it. We've had the pleasure of discussing elitism in art. Who gets to make art? What is good art? And it is honestly the highlight of every week that we do it. A couple of challenges that we're experiencing: sustainability, not because of student interest or because of student commitment, but rather institutional support. We are one of the groups that doesn't receive yearly funding, and we are always looking for intentional partnership and consistent support. We would benefit from universal implementation of accountability practices, and honestly, just more opportunities for our students to engage in difficult dialogue. Thanks for joining us today. And there's the QR code. So if y'all are interested in partnering or want more information about Do Arts, feel free to drop us your email.
Thank you, Francisca, for sharing your efforts and your work. It is now my pleasure to introduce our third and last presenter, Dr. Erica Taylor, orthopedic surgeon, assistant professor with the Department of Orthopedics. So welcome, Dr. Taylor.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So I'll spend just the next few minutes discussing one of our departmental initiatives that started in 2020, titled Division Chief School, Building Community Through the Influence of Division Chiefs Leadership. And for the purpose of this breakfast, I wanted to zoom in on the very first session that occurred just a few months ago, entitled Tackling Racism. As Dr. Crouch had mentioned, I am a Vice Chair of Diversity and Inclusion for the Department of Orthopedic Surgery and Orthopedic Hand Surgeon. And beginning December 1, I'll be the inaugural PDC Associate Chief Medical Officer of Diversity and Inclusion. So when we talk about Division Chief School, this is really an initiative that looks at how leaders in our respective departments can be held accountable for instrumentally implementing some of these principles and guiding ideas behind making an inclusive work environment for us. This was developed earlier in the year by Dr. Allison Toth, who serves as our Orthopedic Surgery Vice Chair of Faculty, otherwise known as our Vice Chair for Faculty because of her advocacy. The idea was to focus on key areas of department-centric leadership and look at the development of professionalism for our divisional leaders. So some may ask, why focus on division leaders? Well, in our department and in many others in the School of Medicine, they are part of the team of key decision makers, huge influencers in the way and the methodology and the environment in which we work. They're involved in decisions about recruitment, retention, education of trainees, students, and fellows, clinical practice decisions, academic promotion decisions, and funds management. So the idea was to have 8 sessions over 8 months, approximately 2 hours per session, of this cohort of division leaders, of our division chiefs. It would be led by experts as well as an external coach, executive coach. This was important for transparency and confidentiality. And the sessions would be interactive and longitudinal. There would be associated metrics with each topic, and of course it would be dynamic. Some of the topics in the planning included communication, diversity, professionalism, financial stewardship, understanding the funds flow of Duke University and the health system and the School of Medicine, and then organizational issues. And I mentioned dynamic and bolded it here on this presentation because, as many have alluded to, after May 2020, a movement has happened at Duke University. I've been here affiliated with Duke for almost 20 years, and this was one of the few movements that I have witnessed in my time that really shook up policy and practices. So, sticking with the concept of Division Chief School, we had to make some adjustments. We had plenary sessions between myself and Dr. Toth and really honed in on how can we make diversity more high impact and more integrative in our experiences. So here we are, session 1 was now designated as tackling racism. Each of the division chief participants, and there were 12, received a copy of the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. There was a pre-discussion activity. Here are a few of the questions listed here, including, what is implicit bias? Describe an example. An excerpt from the book was included, and the division chiefs were asked to comment on examples of racial neutrality and colorblindness and how that can mask racism. The actual session itself was facilitated by experts in this field, as well as Dr. Toth, including Dr. Harry Stafford, and one of our former residents who's now in practice, Dr. Kwadu, otherwise known as Kojo Owusu. It was important to have these panelists here for our session to facilitate dialogue, to review narratives, to review experiences, and importantly, to review anonymous quotes submitted detailing the experiences of Duke Orthopedics faculty, staff, and trainees. Post-session reflection was also important, where we asked the question, what can we do? And from it, 3 themes resonated in terms of how the attainment of DE&I goals will be assessed. Here's just an example of one, improving the environment, with specific metrics of what we would look at longitudinally to make a difference and ensure that actions were actually being taken. The 3 topics for the post-session reflection and thus accountability metrics included improving the environment in addition to recruitment, retention, salary equity, and then lastly, increased opportunity and visibility of minority faculty. I'll go over just a few seconds of the post-session survey results, but it's important to note that this session does not end with session 1. It will be reassessed, revamped, and then repeated, and that's important. From 11 out of 12 attendees who responded to the survey, 100% found the session beneficial. 10 out of the 11 recommended the session for the remainder of our department. 1 was a maybe. 100% said they were interested in learning more about racism after the session. And then 100% found this interactive format preferable to our usual yearly implicit bias training. So in conclusion, why is this initiative important? Well, it has the features of being integrative, and that's something that I firmly believe in, is integrating everything we're discussing into our everyday work and learning experiences. It's replicable, so the hope is that perhaps another department can take pieces of this, the framework for it, and implement it so that their key decision makers are held accountable. And to that note, the metrics I mentioned, the way it will be revamped, revised, and followed longitudinally confers explicit accountability, just a few of the ingredients necessary for sustainability. So thank you for your time. This is my email address here, and it's been just an honor to share this with the university.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. We've certainly heard some outstanding efforts and initiatives shared. We will now open the floor for about 7 minutes for questions for Q&A from our respective presenters.
thank you to the presenters. Unless there are any questions, I think we'll move on to the next part of the program.
Kim, there may be some in our Q&A. If folks can look in their Q&A on their screen, there are several questions, I believe, for respective presenters. So.
Okay, somebody asked, Erica, how will you measure the training effectiveness?
That's a great question. So I'm sorry I had to breeze through the slide so quickly, but on the first metric category, improvement in environment, one of the key factors was counting the number of complaints, either formally to OIE or to our departmental HR, that have to do with hostile work environments or microaggressions, and following that number over time. In addition, taking cues from the Culture Pulse survey that we take on a routine basis and formulating questions pertinent to division leadership. So asking the members of division leaders of divisions, how included do you feel in your division? Do you feel as if your leader has practices, principles of diversity, equity, inclusion? And then looking at trends over time. I think it's easy to have metrics that are short term, immediately after training, did you see a difference? But doing it periodically throughout the course of a year, and then the following year as part of their end of the year feedback is what will make this key and sustainable.
Thank you. So here's a question for Diversify IT. It says, can you share lessons learned around the open mic program for those of us who may want to try something similar? And also, how did you engage other staff of color in conversations?
I'll start, Laura. Quiet that around those 2 weeks, people started coming to us, sort of. We had our brown bag lunches that are monthly Diversify IT lunches where we talk about IT stuff. And it turned into similar open mics. And eventually we realized that we needed to give people space to speak because we kept running out of time and we did not have enough room for everyone to share their moment. One thing that we had to make clear, though, for anybody that's trying to do this in their areas is you have to make it a safe place. You have to make sure that people are there to support, people are there to participate, not watch, not be silent, not sit with their videos off, participate and care about what's going on. So that has to be clear, that has to be taught first before you can go forward with an open mic.
Yeah, I'd add to that, respond. That's what we did. We heard from both our IT staff colleagues and our IT leaders, and we responded specifically to those asks. We heard from IT leaders, we want more, and we heard from our IT staff, we want to be heard, and we brought those two together. So go with what you're already doing. It's very important to use the basis of what is working now. You're being told, I guarantee the information's there. Take it and do the next right thing for your community by listening to what's being asked specifically in that context. Go with context, go with what's being heard and respond.
Okay, thank you. So then here's another question about funding. So this can be answered by all of you. How do you secure funding, if any?
I can answer that one. So this is going to be one of those forever questions. Until recently, diversity initiatives were not necessarily seen as something that would either capture value in terms of reimbursement or funding or be worth the investment. One thing I will say is that it comes from department leadership. In orthopedics, we're very fortunate to have a chair who invests in the development of not only the leaders, but those who have to follow them. And so for our initiative, one of the biggest expenses was having an executive coach. She is one of the premier executive coaches, one who is very great at facilitating these difficult conversations. And that's a resource that we're funding in our department. As we broaden this, though, I think it's important to seek grant funding. So we recently obtained grant funding for diversity efforts for our department, and just repeating that cycle to prove that this is something worth the investment. It's worth the retention and the recruitment of great talented faculty and students and residents. And so making the case from the leadership at the top down has been effective for us. And I think there was a question about pushback as well. It's really about messaging, creativity, meeting people where they are, and really building the case for having a diverse and inclusive workforce.
I think for students, we're departmentally recognized, but we're not departmentally funded. So all of our money comes from the student funding committee. I think we ask a lot of departments for money, and sometimes we get some money from them, but generally it is a grassroots effort. And if y'all have suggestions on how to get more money, just feel free to share those.
Well, we want to thank all of our presenters, and we will certainly address other questions that folks have posed through our communication. But at this time, again, I want to thank all the presenters, and now back to Kim.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to presenters and to all of you for your great questions. So before we shift into the into the panel, we're going to have you respond to a poll question. So Selden, if you want to pull up the poll question. So in this moment, which of the following interests you the most? Healthcare impacts of race, what the election tells us about our challenges and opportunities, how do we overcome barriers to achieving racial equity, or something else? So just take a second and submit a response to the poll before we shift into our panel. Great, thank you, Selden. So a lot of folks interested in how we overcome barriers, and I second something I think many of us in this moment are thinking about is the election. So thank you for that feedback as we shift into our panel discussion. So if our panelists would turn on their mics and audio. I'd like to begin with each of you just taking a moment to introduce yourselves to the audience. Viviana, would you like to start?
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. I'm Viviana Martinez Bianchi. I am a family doctor and Director of Health Equity in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. I have been one of the co-founders and leaders of Latin19, the Latinx advocacy team and interdisciplinary network for COVID-19 that started during this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Jane?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Jane Ifekwinigwe. I wear two hats. I'm a medical anthropologist and a senior research scholar in the Center on Genomics, Race, Identity, Difference. And then I'm also the Associate Director for Engagement for the Center for Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, which is actually part of a TRHT national movement. We are one of 25 campuses that have such centers, and the mission of the TRHT movement, which is obviously very relevant to today's event, is dismantling the belief in a hierarchy of human value based on race.
Thank you. Guy.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Guy Charles. I'm a law professor at Duke Law School, where I teach and write about constitutional law, election law, race and law. I also co-direct our Center for Law, Race, and Politics, and it's my pleasure to be here with you this morning.
So thank you again, all of you, for being here today. And the first question I'm going to ask you is kind of relative to the second most interested question in the poll. But can you talk about what you think the demographic outcomes of this election tell us about the challenges we face in addressing racial inequities and where we should focus our efforts in this moment?
I'll take that first. I'm going to use my social science lens. In particular, I'm a medical anthropologist by training. And I think it's important for us to take an intersectional approach to this, particularly looking at the election outcomes. It's notable, I mean, and in particular, when I'm talking about an intersectional approach, I'm thinking about particularly the intersection of gender, race, and class. And we frequently overlook the class perspective when we're addressing election outcomes. And I think it is incredibly notable to be mindful of how educational attainment plays a role in election outcomes. Many people may not know that 64% of the electorate is not college educated. You know, so to ponder a little bit how educational attainment might have an impact on voting trends and voting outcomes. I think race is also significant in terms of both how race has become politicized and identity politics have played such a significant role in people's voting patterns and trends. And I think this is most notable in terms of those who have voted for Trump. You know, whiteness is being reconfigured as kind of the aggressor as the victim, and propagating notions of white anxiety and white fear, and you know, kind of deniability in terms of historical incidents that I think there is enough evidence to their reality, such as those who are discrediting the existence of enslavement in spite of all of the evidence to the contrary. And then, of course, gender, and, you know, in terms of not only the significant role that the Black women, those sung and those unsung, you know, such as our Stacey Abrams and Alicia Garza, and as well as those that aren't celebrated, you know, who got out the vote, you know, who fought against voter suppression and just consistently in their communities over time, over centuries, really, you know, fought for the liberation and freedom of all of community members. So the intersection of race and class is really important, but also ethnicity in terms of specifically looking, I mean, there's certain groups where notions of heterogeneity and not being a monolith are addressed, such as in the Latinx community. There are lots of conversation recognizing that the Latinx community is not homogeneous, you know, but rarely do we ever think about the incredible heterogeneity of the Black community as it pertains to ethnicity, because I think there's a historical context for that in terms of the legal sort of conflation of Blackness dating back to enslavement. So what are the voting trends and patterns of recent African and Caribbean immigrants? In terms of African immigrants, they tend to be more conservative, and they tend to vote on the basis of religious affiliations, you know, so those that are more conservative will be, for example, anti-abortion or anti-LGBTQ rights. You know, so how does that that notion of African immigrant conservatism play into our understanding of Blackness and Black voting patterns and trends?
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to have to turn it to Guy. I think in my anxiety in the morning and your humility, I forgot to call you out for being an MSNBC and NBC contributor. So yay, we kind of have a star in our midst. But I'm going to turn to you now.
So a couple of things that I think are also worth thinking about, building on some of the things that Jane has said. We definitely have a country that is divided, and it's divided obviously on the basis of partisanship, but also on the basis of ideology and on the basis of race. So on average, most people of color vote for the Democratic Party, generally view socioeconomic rights as rights that are very important to them. On average, and again, that's on average, whites tend to vote for the Republican Party. And if you're thinking through a question of how do you address fundamental racial issues, it's going to have to be addressed from a partisan lens. That is not something that we have unity on, that we have a common perspective on. As a country, we tend to view those very differently. We tend to view it through a racial lens. Jane also talked about the different intersectionalities that come into play. So I think that will present some challenges for an incoming Biden administration. And for those of you wondering, there will be an incoming Biden administration. So notwithstanding sort of all the legal shenanigans, it's just a ghost ship traveling through the night. So eventually reality will come into play. There would be some challenges for that administration because it will have to pursue, as it should and wants to, as articulated, wants to pursue a racial justice agenda, but it will have to do it strictly along partisan lens. So if they capture the Senate and they will hold on to the House, then it will be able to pursue its racial justice agenda. But there will likely be also backlash because it's a very divided country, and it's divided precisely along the types of issues and questions that we're talking about and that many of us care about. And so one can't expect that there won't be a backlash to pursuing, particularly if it's a robust and worthwhile racial justice agenda.
Thank you. Viviana, I want you to respond to the first question, but then I'm gonna sort of weave in our second question that touches on something both Jane and Guy talked about. So in the early day, I think earlier in the week even, there was this very focused narrative and attention on what people saw as increases in support for Donald Trump among Black men and among Latinx people. So can you share some of your thoughts and anything that you'd like to add, and just generally reflecting on the first question about why there is discussion about these two outcomes? Maybe talk a little bit about the diversity within the Latinx community and how that impacts, and what's good and bad about this focus, and what can we learn about some of these trends?
Yes, thank you, Kimberly. I think that perhaps the biggest attention came from seeing the Hispanic vote as a rising vote, that there were more people that were going to be voting in this election that were Hispanics or Latinx than prior years. However, I think there has been that in general, the media didn't look at how diverse, how non-monolithic the Latino community is. Even though President Trump had talked constantly against immigrants and against, calling names to Mexicans, calling them rapists, etc. A large portion of the Latinx community are not necessarily immigrants. They are established citizens of different states that did not consider that kind of approach was about them. So we have seen that 66% of Hispanic people in general voted for Biden, but men were more likely than women to vote for Trump. But again, it's still, it goes about that Hispanic men being more of a swing vote, looking at, what are the issues? Is it an economic issue? Less likely to look for a party in particular, is still kind of shifting around independently. Jane had mentioned earlier, the issue of abortion happens to be a strong issue for many of the members of the Hispanic population. But both parties have been courting the Hispanic vote in big numbers, right? Like, and I'm so happy to see that Latinos in general are being considered. But again, there's a big diversity within the Latino community, with more recent immigrants, citizens having more likely voted for Biden and not for President Trump. I think as a Latina myself, perhaps one of the surprises of the election in general, and as somebody who was looking at this election from a perspective of equity and health equity in particular, I think some of us were surprised that there wasn't a bigger proportion of the US electorate voting for Vice President Biden, right? This idea that those of us, I think what happens is that those of us who have who are looking at life through a center for a lens of equity or health equity, felt much more, felt that it was so much, we thought that maybe more people were looking at that, and it doesn't seem to be so. So I think we continue to have a lot of work to do in regards to equity after this election. For many people, equity was not, or health outcomes was not the reason for their vote.
Thank you, Viviana. Jane, you began to unpack this second question in your response to the first question. You talked about sort of the inattention to the diversity that lies within the Black community. And then I guess if you could talk a little bit more about that and what you think it means that there's attention on this, and to some degree that's a bit more focused, and there isn't as loud a conversation about the trends in the white community that you also began to touch on in your response to the first question.
Oh, thank you, Kim. I mean, the reality is that the emphasis has been on shifting voting trends, particularly as they pertain to Black men. But the reality is that still over 90% of Black women voted for Trump, and over 80% of Black men voted for Trump. But I mean, sorry, what am I saying? 80% of Black women voted for Biden. Back up. 90% of Black women voted for Biden, and over 80% of Black men voted for Biden. But the emphasis is on those who voted for Trump, trying to suggest that, he represented some sort of hero for the Black community, and he himself propagated that. But, those Black men who did voice an opposition to both Biden and Harris had specific reasons for doing that frequently. In addition to what Viviana mentioned in terms of the economic impulse, what was also significant was their relationship to crime and punishment. And Biden, even though he apologized, Biden's affiliation with the Clinton's 1994 crime bill, and also Harris's long and contentious prosecutorial record in California, because the fact still remains that although adult Blacks represent 12% of the US population, we represent 33% of the prison population. So people were voting on the basis of their resistance to the mass incarceration of Black men and women, really as a continuation of Jim Crow, as the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander calls it. So I think that we really have to kind of unpack that hyper emphasis. And then of course there were others who were talking about the rappers, the specific celebrity rappers such as 50 Cent and Ice Cube and others who voted for Trump, as a way to kind of signal something else. I mean, their impulse was really, tied to, to economics in terms of his, really being perceived as someone whose interests really are in the ruling class and the wealthy and the elite.
So Guy, I guess, your opinion is going to be informed, on your lived experience and your, intellectual and scholarly perspective. But if you could share your thoughts about this issue.
Sure. I mean, I largely agree with Jane. when you look at the numbers, you're looking at a group of people who are basically can be counted upon to vote for the Democratic Party. Certainly at the margins, there are going to be some defection, and there are some reasons here why there might have been some defection, particularly on class and crime policy issues. But it also points to, I think, the burden on the Biden-Harris administration, which is that they're going to have to deliver on policies that matter, specifically to the Black community, but also to the Latinx communities. Joe Biden and his speech a couple days ago acknowledged his debt to the Black community. And that has to translate itself, that's to cash out into specific policies that improve the lives of people. Otherwise, they will continue to defect from the political process. I mean, you saw a downturn from 2008 to 2012, and then also from 12 to 16, because people are asking themselves, look, I can, you ask me to show up to vote, I can show up and be reliable voters, and the most reliable voters in the Democratic Party are Black women and Black people. And so if those folks are sort of your core voters and they're showing up, the question that they're going to continually ask themselves, especially after this election, will be, well, what are the policies that are going to matter to our community? And top among those policies are the criminal justice policies. We saw the racial reckoning in the last few months that is centered around criminal justice, but also economic justice issues, right? And then one could go beyond that, but there has to be a tangible difference, right? Political participation has to actually matter. It has to make a difference in the lives of people. And I think the similar thing for the Latinx community, which is growing as a pivotal electoral bloc. And we see some of the differences that community has made in the Southwest, but also that it matters, for example, in places like Florida. And so the question will be, what are the specific policies that speak to particular constituency groups that improves their lives? And Viviana talked about equity, right? What does that mean in this particular context writ large? And I think that's the challenge for this incoming administration. It actually has to deliver in a very specific way. Otherwise, a different type of reckoning will come in 4 years down the road.
Thank you. Wow. So kind of shifting a little bit, why do some Americans seem to place greater value on their personal ideology than their own health, and in fact seem willing to accept misinformation about COVID and to rely on it? Viviana?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the issues that we forget about the American response to COVID-19 is that how much culture, religion, tradition, the way we behave, answers how we respond to the pandemic. I like to see it more in a difference with what some Eastern countries have done. COVID-19 requires a community response. We live in a very individualistic society in the US in comparison to countries in Asia, where Confucianism places this very significant emphasis on the importance of respect for society values, for the community, for a certain harmony, social harmony. And in the US, we tend to value this individualistic pursuit of like, it is my right, it is my way. I do not want to wear this mask, and therefore it's my right to do so. And we forget to think about how maybe message this in a way that is more about, it's your individual, what is it, how do we need to look at this? Is more of what we need to do is, why are people relying misinformation? What has happened nationally that our response to the pandemic, and whether wearing or not wearing a mask, has become a politicized view, right? Why is it? Why did we see that one party's meetings where we covered masks and distance and even virtually, and the other one where with mass numbers of people really going against public health responses? So we cannot isolate people's individual responses to COVID-19 from what we saw coming as a message from our national response. So I think there's a combination of things. There's this culture on how individualistic U.S. culture in general is, and that pursuit of being the individual athletes in the event, versus other cultures that really pay much more respect to that harmony and conformity to society's ways. The issue here also that the society's ways, or the way of the national response, has been very divided among party lines, which made it a lot more difficult to do what we needed to do for a virus that requires isolation, or being practicing safe sex, the 6 feet of distance, wearing a mask, and washing hands.
Viviana, this is, I mean, I think to most of us seems like an unprecedented kind of, I mean, can you think of an example where, personal health and safety was divorced from, or was somehow being driven not by, general understandings of what's safe and healthy?
I'm sorry, I don't. I just think as a healthcare professional, as somebody who's been, with one foot on clinical family medicine, another foot on public health, as somebody who works globally as a executive member of the World Organization of Family Doctors, connecting with family doctors from all over the world, and connecting with the World Health Organization, it is really, it's almost like this mind-boggling thing for me to see, why aren't we united? It should be all of us against that virus, and all of us creating that distance. I did also realize that in my US-centric view, as somebody who's lived I'm an immigrant, but I've lived in the US for 30 years, that I really underestimated initially the knowledge of our African colleagues, our colleagues in Africa who have dealt with Ebola, for example, and they were so much more prepared and more ready. The use of PPE, they could train the whole world on how to use it. We were fumbling through what do we do with this, and we had colleagues from the rest of the world in Asia and Africa who really, really knew it. And I think there was an underestimation of the power of this global response that we needed to do. And again, as part of that isolated individualistic view, the US decided to kind of go it all along. We are separating from the rest of the world, and we were going to have our response. And then we see the outcomes that we see.
Thank you. Thank you. Jane, do you have some thoughts on this notion of ideology versus health?
I do. And I thank Viviana for starting it in terms of, talking about the cult of individualism here in the United States. But I want to go in a slightly different direction, partially tied to what I said earlier. I really want to encourage people to read Jonathan Metzl's work. Jonathan Metzl is a psychiatrist and a sociologist at Vanderbilt, and last year wrote a book really based on, firsthand interviews and interactions across what he calls the heartland. The title of the book is Dying of Whiteness, The Politics of Racial Resentment, the subtitle being The Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. And since the COVID pandemic has been writing a lot about seeing what he observed when researching the book as really being an amplification of what he saw when he was writing the book. What he uncovered when he was writing the book is how what he's calling white structural anxiety, as it's manifest in particular politics, is playing out in terms of people responding in ways that are antithetical to their well-being and their health. I'm going to cite a little extract of a recent article that he wrote, wherein he talks about the normalization of white structural anxiety and white identity politics, to the point where racial anxiety is not only correct, but should be the basis of how they vote, how they assemble, how they live, and how they die. And in particular, he was looking at resistance to the Affordable Care Act, resistance to the expansion of Medicaid, pro-gun laws, the cutting off of social services and schools. And what he was finding was a direct correlation between life expectancy rates, dropout rates, gun suicides in the white communities that were pro-gun, and so really looking at how those are tied into this broader issue of disinformation, which Guy alluded to as well, in terms of the fact that the people are getting their information, from the wrong channels. So there's a kind of an anti-science rhetoric at play, where people are more likely to trust someone, talking about shining light through the body or injecting bleach, as opposed to listening to, as Viviana was saying, the logical conclusion that wearing a mask will save lives. And we're now at 144,000 and counting COVID deaths.
Kim, if I may also build on both of those points, because there is, I think, an interesting relationship between individualism and whiteness. I mean, I see it in sort of the field that I study, voting rights, but also across other types of social provisions, whether it's education, anything that can be considered to be a common good, and which would be viewed as benefiting a broad group of people, especially folks of color, then people will tend to limit the good and privatize it. And so we'd rather not have national health care because we're worried that, well, it's going to benefit people of color. So we're just going to go at it alone and we're going to privatize it, we're going to make it individual. We do the same thing with education. We do the same thing with universal voting, right? Sort of there is that relationship between racial anxiety and who do we think we're going to benefit from that public good. And then the attempt then is to privatize and to narrow as much as possible, even if it harms the community broadly, including white communities, right? So people would rather go without healthcare than to have it broadly available if the assumption is that, well, folks of color are also going to benefit from it. Right, so that's part of our that's part of our ethos, and we see it play out not just in politics but also in law. So it is embedded in some ways into sort of the type of divide that we have in this country that we're always trying to fight against, that we're always trying to address, and it's an important point that both Viviana and Jane have surfaced here, and I see it playing out as well. And the fields that I study.
So I think what you described really connected to my next question, and I think is sort of what drives these structures of inequality, right? So from the context of where you sit and the work that you do, where do you see your greatest opportunity to dismantle these structures of inequality and to try to address some of the disproportionate negative impacts of the pandemic on Black and Brown communities?
So I work in healthcare, and I think that our greatest opportunity lies on looking at healthcare quality with a health equity lens, measuring health equity and how equitable are we in the provision of healthcare. Health equity is rooted in the ethical principle of justice and requires providing everyone the opportunity to achieve good health. Now, I'm very certain that healthcare alone only contributes in 20% to health outcomes, but still we need to start somewhere in our own institution of health. So the pursuance of health equity from our environment, from where I work at Duke Health, requires an intersectional approach, a syndemic approach, and it requires addressing inequities, understanding the care of the individual patient in the context of his or her community, understanding, researching, and training to recognize the roles of bias and discrimination in systems and making needed changes to decrease their negative impact. For example, during the pandemic, We're hearing from Latino families who haven't heard from the team because the team didn't have a way to connect with them. Maybe there wasn't an interpreter available at the time they needed to call the family. So we have Latino families calling us thinking they have a disappeared person. They are not able to find their patient. So a measure of quality will be that if a patient doesn't speak the English language, is their interpreter, for example, immediately contacted? This is when there is language barriers. We need to look at gaps in access or inadequate care for disadvantaged groups and look at really how are we doing? Are we measuring? Are we looking at race, ethnicity, gender data? Are we looking, are we providing the same care to immigrants and non-immigrants? We need to address health determinants, both negatives and positive ones, using a community health assessment that looks at problems as well as social capital. And we need to pay attention to the root causes of disease and wellness, because it is through that knowledge that we will learn from our community how to make a positive difference. We need to involve our community, the Durham community, in designing how we approach access to healthcare, in designing how we approach it. We need to have a patient advisory boards, community advisory boards to the way we do things. And those community advisory boards need to include people who live in the community, not the leaders, not the privileged ones, a Latina like me who has health insurance, who has a great salary, etc. We need to look at the people who live in our Durham community as part of the expert and for them to share expertise. Partnering with community organizations, respecting their history and leadership, engaging in cross-sector dialogue, and we have to stop tolerating inequities. We have to definitely stop doing so.
Jane or Guy, do you want to?
I can jump in, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about the work we're doing at the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. As I mentioned, it's a national movement, which has an overarching mission, which I talked about before. Our particular mission is to dismantle deeply rooted beliefs in racial hierarchies and disrupt persistent structures and impacts of racism at Duke and Durham and beyond. And you'll notice many of the different centers actually define community in terms of the campus community, but as we all know, there is a deeply entangled relationship between Duke and Durham, both in terms of the fact that Duke is one of the major employers of Durham residents, but also because of that longstanding and deeply rooted relationship between the campus and the community. But I think that in terms of opportunities, we take a very holistic and integrated approach to how we do our work. And it's actually very much informed by a framework, which is a holistic framework. And its foundational pillars are narrative change, racial healing, and relationship building. With a narrative change, we address the fact that in relation to race and racism, there are many truths and untruths about our national histories, state histories, our local histories, and our universities' histories, which need to be exposed and changed. And this is obviously relevant here in our university context in terms of uncovering Duke's history and its complicit engagement and involvement with enslavement and other oppressive practices. Racial healing and relationship building acknowledge that in order for each of us to heal from the wounds of the past, we must build mutually respectful relationships across racial and ethnic lines that honor and value each person's humanity. These new trusting relationships will better reflect our common humanity, and most importantly, in terms of your question, Kim, expand the circles of engagement of those willing to work towards dismantling racism and sustained transformation. And then in terms of the structures, and the structures are really where, as both Viviana and Guy and I have mentioned, the structures where these inequities and forms of systemic racism reside and thrive are in separation, law, and the economy. And so in order to dismantle them, we have to work simultaneously writing new truths, uncovering the falsehoods, and then writing new truths, building relationships where we are mindful, as you said in your beginning, Kim, of the interconnectedness of individual, interpersonal, and institutional forms of racism. And then we need to look at how these play out in our specific Duke context, and in terms of, so we can think about it nationally, globally, statewide, community, but change starts at home. And so we have, for our center, have 3 specific goals, which are centered around the movement itself in terms of truth, racial healing, and transformation. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share our 3 goals for you, which we achieve through what we call evidence, engagement, and education. So our first goal is truth. Uncover, produce, and share accurate and complete narratives about race, racial hierarchies, and racism. Now, the roots of racism are, in the long march of human history, are relatively new and date back really to the Age of Enlightenment and the 18th and 19th century. So if they can be made and invented by humans, they can be dismantled by humans. Racial healing. Cultivate relationships that celebrate our common humanity, embrace our diversity, and expand the circles of individuals willing to work toward transformation. And then finally, transformation. Foster lasting change wherein every life has equal value, and the consequences of a false belief in a racial hierarchy no longer shape our individual and collective experiences or outcomes. And so we do that through research. We do that through education activities. Many of you here in the audience may have participated in one of our Transforming Dialogues series, or in our RX Racial Healing circles, or in our story circles. In fact, tonight we're doing a Transforming Dialogues on transforming post-election dialogues on race and belonging in America. Tomorrow we're doing another one for Teach House Fellows on transforming dialogues on racial equity in education. We've done other transforming dialogues on race and racism. And then obviously the RX Racial Healing Circles, for those of you who've experienced them, are really an opportunity for people to come together, not on the basis of what divides us, but on the basis of what unites us. And we use storytelling and deep listening, not only to expand our circles of engagement, as I've talked about, but also for people to see themselves in someone else, and to have increased perspective taking and increased empathy, and to recognize that in many instances, we have a shared humanity and we have a common humanity, and to focus on that rather than these divisive ways in which people are being ideologically forced to think about the differences among us.
Thank you, Jane. And really, what you've said about expanding the circle of engagement, or expanding the community of people who are really committed to this, resonates so much, and really kind of goes back to one of the 3 questions I posed at the beginning about, how can we all work to try to increase we live in this very polarized world, and how do we, within that context, engage more people and bring more people who are willing, apart from this notion of making people do certain things, how to expand the community of folks who are willing to push this energy towards racial equity. Guy, do you have some thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, one of the benefits of being third in this conversation is that I get to borrow from the awesome wisdom of my 2 co-panelists. So I can build on a couple of the things that they've talked about. The first part is acknowledging the structure that reproduces racial inequity and hierarchy. Often people are looking for the bad actor, the person with the bad intent, sort of the bad person that is defined as the racist, and nobody wants to be that it person. Right? But really what we ought to be thinking about are, what are the structures that reproduce inequality, and how can we uproot those structures? And then also to help people understand, when we do that, we create an environment that works better for everyone. And I think that's the part that has been hard to come across historically in this environment, but also in the US. So when you try to expand the things that benefit everybody, people call it socialist or communist. And that's true whatever you do, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's voting, whether it's employment. If you try to expand something that benefits, the resistance is ideological and framed in a pejorative way. And I think part of the goal is to help people understand that we actually all benefit when we have structures that are more equitable. Inclusion means everyone, and everybody becomes better off. So it is true that when you're dismantling structural hierarchies, that the people at the top have to come down a bit. So that is true, but overall, everybody benefits. When you create a workplace that is equitable, it means that even people who thought that they didn't need the procedures and processes will now actually have access. So parental leave is extended to men who want it, right? Even though, 30, 40, 50 years ago, men would have thought, well, no, I don't want to be a part of that. That's not for me. But recognize that they benefit, have a role to play, and are beneficiaries of making workplaces more equitable. And that goes the same for the economy, and it goes the same for our educational processes and systems. So helping people understand that equity is something that benefits us all, I think is the fundamental task. And rooting out structural inequality redounds to the benefit of a community writ large. And I think that's something that I think we all have to do a better job of articulating and explaining, and it's something that Viviana and Jane just articulated very beautifully, and I see it as well in my work, that's the task, and that's what we're trying to do, to bring everybody along and to show them, for example, in the voting context, if we all have access, and you actually saw this in this election, the litigation that preceded the election that made it easier for people to vote didn't just benefit, say, folks of color or folks at the margins. It made it easier for everybody to participate. And so entrenching those gains, that's the task, but it comes with making the case that equity and inclusion benefits the community as a whole. And it's something that people take for, that they don't fully understand, that they don't internalize. And I think getting them to recognize that point might get us at least part of the way there.
Thank you. And I think part of that is, engaging like we are today to help educate us all to be able to make that case I think is part of the work. So this leads me to my last question before we open it up for Q&A. So what do you think is most important for us to sustain our efforts if we kind of come back locally to Duke? And again, thinking about how we sustain the work, keep it moving, and get broader buy-in and create greater accountability.
So I think we have an opportunity at Duke to become a socially accountable system. I look at this from the health system, but it's also probably to other aspects. The World Health Organization describes social accountability as the obligation of medical institutions and academic centers to direct their education, research, and service activities towards addressing the priority health concerns of the community, region, and or nation they have a mandate to serve. In my view of community, is always all of Durham and surrounding counties. I just want to share a shocking moment I had when I saw that Duke had advertised that there was now a mobile testing van for COVID-19. I was like, for a community mobile testing van. I'm like, oh my God, finally we're going all over the community. And then I realized it was for the community students and faculty. I was like, no, it's our community that needs it. So for healthcare, right, to be socially accountable, it must be equitable, accessible to everyone, and responsive to patient, community, and population health needs. Social accountability in healthcare intentionally targets healthcare education, research and services, and addresses social determinants of health towards the priority health concerns of the people and communities served, with the goal of achieving health equity. A lot to do with what Guy and Jane were sharing, right? Is this, by improving equity, we improve the lives of everybody. So we need to demonstrate social accountability through engagement, through investment in the local community. We need to do upstream work requiring multi-sector partnerships to improve health in approaches that are organized, that do not leave vulnerable populations behind, that we value every member of a community, that we enhance services for those most in need, and engage all socioeconomic groups in understanding that equity improves the lives of everyone in the community. Something we have done with the Latin 19 group is to bring to our panels our conversations. We meet every Wednesday at noon, and we have in there decision makers from health system, from different schools. We have lawyers, social worker, clinicians, and community members who come in and talk about their expertise. And I can tell it is not the same if I share with our decision makers how the community is being impacted by COVID-19 is one way, but when the community member actually shares how they are impacted from their own words, from their own suffering, it suddenly opens eyes, I have the sense that we are all good people, but often we are blinded by who is it that we look at? What are we looking at? And so, and forgetting to see what is going on in our communities. So Boiling proposes a social obligation scale where accountability is one of the most important criteria for excellence in medical education. And he suggests that to become socially accountable, academic medical centers must anticipatively, right? We need to anticipate and adapt medical education and services to the local needs. One of the things that we didn't do in the pandemic was to anticipate who was going to be the most affected, which neighborhoods should we get access to testing at. If you looked at where the testing sites organized by Duke, we're all in campus or in affluent white neighborhoods. And there were no testing sites in the east side until July, when we opened Holton, which is a little bit more east, and it's in a neighborhood right surrounded by both a Hispanic and a Black neighborhood in Durham. It wasn't until then, July, where we had access to testing that was free of charge, regular, so the community could get it there. So we have to think about, anticipate what the community is needing, bring the community to tell us what is it that's needed in there for us to do a better job. We want to define institutional objectives together with society. We want to contextualize educational programs to improve local health outcomes and focus the evaluation on impact. How are we impacting? All of our evaluation often is like, there's press gaining reports, but who actually answers those reports? Who is actually looking at the reports? Is our community truly judging how we're doing? And then utilize our partners, ask our own community to assess our programs, and then we have to graduate through change agents. Every one of our graduates of all of our schools, of all of our centers, have to be true change agents that have a health equity lens in the way they do their work.
Thank you.
I'll jump in really as an echo to a lot of what Viviana has said, in terms of who are the change agents. And I think we really need to, here at Duke, reframe who are the drivers of racial equity work. There is a notion that those most directly impacted, those of us who are racially subjugated and most directly impacted by racial inequities and just systemic and structural racism are currently the ones performing the affective labor. And we need to reframe it as, kind of once again, picking up on what Guy was saying, not only will all lives be improved, but everyone can have a stake in this racial equity work that is not just it's not just the purview of people of color. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about expanding those circles of engagement to include everyone. That notion of none of us is free until we all are free. And I want to, if you'll indulge me, because it's a strap line and a philosophy that drives so much of what I do. And here I'm going to invoke the late great Audre Lorde and the notion that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I'd like to just kind of expand her poetic observation. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. So a reframing is necessary for us to really have, in Kim's word, sustainable transformation, because obviously the old ways have not been working. We've tried this before and it's not working. So let's dismantle the house and start from the ground up.
Thank you, Jane.
I don't have too much more to add to these wisdoms. I think the only thing that I would stress is there is a unique opportunity at this time and place at Duke, where there is an express focus on thinking about racial equity and inclusion. There are announced standards and there are processes that are being developed. And the question then will be, can we deliver on what we have promised? And how can we hold ourselves and the institution accountable for transformation within as well as for transformation without? It isn't, it's unusual that there's this unique moment and opportunity and express commitment. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to try to take advantage of that commitment and to see whether we can deliver on the announced purpose and to hold ourselves accountable for what we have said that we are going to do, and then to look back and to see whether we actually have done it, and what ways have we transformed, and in what ways have we fallen short, both internally, right, as an institution, but also the impact that we're having within the community. And I think that work is one that we all must do collectively because we have announced internally that this is a work that matters to us all, and as an institutionally, and that it is something that we're committed to. And so if that's the goal, then we have to think about the deliverables and to figure out whether we're coming up short or whether we are exceeding our goal. And so taking advantage of this moment, I think, is something that we all must be consciously aware of.
So thank you so much to you. We're now going to open it up for questions. We already have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to start with, let's see here. So someone asked, I think Viviana, this, I keep hearing from people in the community about this disparity of care given to the BIPOC community versus the white community. Is this being researched and addressed, and what is being done?
Thank you for that very important question. In regards to COVID-19, for example, once people got into Duke, the data is showing that they got equitable care, right? Like the outcomes were similar once you were there. The issue that I think what I'm seeing is the bigger issue here is there's also the perception of there's both unconscious bias. There are ways that we are trying, we're working so hard and training. In fact, Erica Taylor was mentioning earlier some of the great efforts that are happening at the School of Medicine. I do think that there is still a history that Jane was referring and Guy was referring earlier about that community and university relationship. In the moment of the pandemic right now, it is very difficult. All of us know that anytime we go to an emergency room, it's so important always to have our family with us. And what the pandemic is doing is that it becomes very difficult because you're only allowed to go in with only one person. Often your family will be your advocate. And we're seeing this, this is affecting the community in ways that we didn't expect, or perhaps we should have expected, but it's this idea that you don't have your advocate with you. If there is a language difference, they're using interpreters, but they are on the phone. The phone doesn't do the same work as having somebody in person who's interpreting for you, who's also interpreting your cultural aspect of health, your values. Often if you speak the same language, your family is there for you and can share how the person has been suffering through this acute illness, for example. And by being there alone, it really depowers the person and creates a more difficult way of expressing those things. And by using interpretation through a phone and instead of having the person in there, also takes away and it becomes more of a translation, which is never as appropriate or doesn't bring together the same skills as you do when you're really truly interpreting. We're getting data. We are now generating data on ethnicity at Duke. We are looking at gender. There are so many areas. I think the question Asa came in, it is an important question and it requires a whole full day of discussions of all the different aspects in which we're working on this. I think what I said earlier before, the idea of working with the community, creating multi-stakeholder groups to really assess and address how we're doing things, democratizing information, promoting scientific equity. We need to become trusted actors in the community and create platforms to share the problem so that by listening to the community, we will understand more what this means, so that we really can provide the care that is not just best in outcomes because people get the medical care, but what about the wraparound? What about the feeling heard? What about the feeling understood? What about is that health equity lens that we need to approach healthcare quality with, that we still are not doing enough, right? We need to really prioritize looking at things, what kind of environments are we creating? Who are the people affected? What kind of who is positively and negatively affected by an issue, and how? What kind of positive environments are we creating? And when people access healthcare, are we distributing resources, like I shared before? Are we distributing testing sites in the community in a way that gets them to be accessible? What are the barriers that we create on clinicians, for example, that need to work clinically but don't have the time to really spend the time to look at the health equity outcomes of the work that they're doing, or that the time to develop a health equity agenda for their own department is not paid. I am very lucky. My Department of Family Medicine and Community Health puts this as a priority, and I have time for me paid to be able to do this work, but it doesn't happen for everybody. So it's really looking at that. And then what are the processes? How are we meaningfully including or excluding people, communities of color, people who are disabled, people who do not speak the language, or LGBTQ plus communities who are affected by health outcomes, and how are they affected by health outcomes? We need to do a lot more research. We are starting to do it. We are doing it. There's several projects all over the institution. One of them is the Ser Hispano project. There are many of them trying to really do good work, but it's new. We just need to continue and doing a lot more of it and engaging with our community. The larger community is so important.
Thank you. So just to the audience, please pose any questions that you have in the chat. So we have another question here. How important do you think the stance that the president took affected the mindset of the community as a whole with respect to wearing masks, I think relative to our efforts to slow the pace of COVID-19?
I wish the president would have said, masks are important. We need to wear them. He kept insistent that early on, Fauci had said they were not important. Well, then the data came in and showed us that this was important. Science evolved. We were able to learn more about what was important and how. And so we needed our leadership to really say it. And I think it really impaired our response. I think we forget how important what leaders do matters, especially if half of the population of this country follows his advice.
Any other thoughts? I guess I think maybe the question also is trying to get at like how impactful that central messaging was, or maybe, you know, relative to kind of that ideology that already exists, or that sense of individualism that makes it difficult in our country to overcome that in order to send these sort of uniform messages.
I think there's a need to disentangle personal liberties for, you know, what Guy was referring to as the collective good. You know, I think at the moment, to wear a mask or not has become kind of a personal liberty issue, when really what it is a public health matter for the collective well-being of all of our people, as opposed to you know, these personal liberties and infringements on one's liberty by wearing or not wearing a mask.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the difficulty. All right, there are these cleavages in American politics, and we can tap into them in any single time. So it could have been possible to frame this completely as a public health question. This is just like wearing a seatbelt. You wear it both for your benefit and other people's benefit. It's like the speed limit. You have to observe it for your benefit as well as other people's benefit. Right, so we could have framed we could easily tap into another framing and have come together in a bipartisan way to address the collective benefits of the question. But there's also an incentive, right, to dive into and to take advantage of a particular framing. And one of the things that we know about American politics, yes, it's polarized, but people take their cues from the elites. So if the elites unify on a particular question, then everybody else generally follows. This is, for example, something that you've seen generally, although not uniformly, with the LGBTQ movement. That was not a major issue in this particular election. Largely because elites have sent the message, and generally, not uniformly, but generally, people have followed. So it wasn't a cleavage that could be tapped into in the same way. So we know that elite cues really do matter, particularly where they are uniform. So had the president said something, and our political parties and partisan divisions, we all came together around that question, there's no doubt that would have made a significant difference. And so that's just a question of what are elites willing to do, and what type of cues that what types of cleavages that they're willing to tap into, and for their own political gains.
I think, if I may add one more thing, COVID has tested our capacity to be kind and generous and patient, and to see beyond ourselves and our own communities, and to stop thinking, oh, I'm healthy, I don't have other problems. It's protecting everybody. It's realizing that I can be an asymptomatic carrier and be spreading this around the people who are around me without even knowing it, and understanding my own responsibility to prevent others from getting sick, and also prevent getting sick myself. And that, I think, is the one lost message here on how important it is to be generous in a time of crisis.
So this next question, I think, is to you, Jane. What do you think of a national model of truth and reconciliation commission for the United States?
What a fantastic question. I'm smiling because Dr. Gail Christopher, who is the architect of the TRHT movement and the RX racial healing methodology that we use in our circle work, has been working quietly behind the scenes with elected officials for the last 3 years, putting together a truth, racial healing, and transformation resolution for a commission. And she specifically does not use reconciliation. In part, when she was thinking about how to frame TRHT, she looked around the world at other reconciliation models, such as in South Africa, in Germany, in Ireland, and found that what was the common thread was that there had been a national conversation acknowledging that harm had been perpetrated and human rights violations had taken place, whether that was the genocide of Aboriginal Australians and the theft of their land, the subjugation of Africans under apartheid, or the genocide as part of the Holocaust and the final solution. So in each of these instances, there had been a moment wherein there was a national reckoning. We have not had that in this country at all. I mean, the closest we've come to that, as Guy noted, was this this summer. The summer of reckoning and discontent. But that wasn't a consensus, and there were still individuals, who weren't part of that. And some were even suggesting that those engagements and those protests and those passions have waned since the summer. So the emphasis really is on transformation, which more accurately speaks to the sustained need for these structures and systems to be dismantled. And then perhaps we can, then we can talk about reconciliation. And so the focus is really on a truth, racial healing and transformation commission, which I think up until this past week was a hope. But I think with our new administration can become a reality, along with talks around what reparations would look like. But specifically, yes, it looks like this resolution will have some legs to stand on with the new administration. This Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Commission. So what you are proposing is already in the works and has been for the last 3 years, and it has a lot of buy-in, not only from elected officials but other change agents across the country.
That's exciting. So Jane, I have a question. So in this model that Dr. Christopher is working on, sort of, because I've seen a lot about how other countries have been more genuine in their reconciliation, and we've just sort of passed over slavery, and genocide of American Indian people as if it didn't really happen. But in this model, the idea is that we will get to that, but we need to do something else first.
It's more that we need to work simultaneously. As I introduced our integrative and holistic framework, we need to work on all of these things simultaneously. So the narrative change is where we have to rewrite. We have to interrogate the falsehoods that characterize our versions of history, and we need to uncover those that have been hidden. And I think that a lot of that work needs to happen before students even get to Duke, because the number of students that myself and my colleagues have taught who have said, why didn't I learn this in K-12 education? Why am I having to come to Duke to learn about the fact that there are more similarities than differences, therefore, between those socially designated races and those who are within a particular socially designated racial group, and that race itself is a social construct, that there are no pure races. Biology informs how we think about race, and Viviana has talked about that in terms of the health disparities that she mentioned. but there are no pure races. But when you think about people's understanding of race, they operate on the basis that race is something real, and so I think a lot of our narrative change has to occur in our K-12 education, but also here in our institutions of higher learning. And then, and as Guy has also mentioned, in our media platforms. I mean, social media for a lot of people is where they get their misinformation and disinformation. So how do people rely on accurate channels of information, and how can we elevate science, back to its appropriate level in our society, where people can seek certainty and reliability in science as opposed to contesting its veracity.
Thank you. So we have another question. So while changing truth is certainly a goal that will move society towards a more equitable space, how does one change someone else's individual truth, which is rooted in their own perspective? I guess, the challenge of reframing and helping others to do the same is a big one. So Guy, do you have some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important and really difficult question. So, for example, when you're looking, Jane just talked about the ecosystem of information and disinformation. And when you look at the attempts by scientists to figure out, okay, how do we change that? When you provide information to people that is inconsistent with their priors, they tend to dig in deeper as opposed to changing their minds, right? So trying to convince people by providing them different sets of information does not seem to work. But perhaps what could work, which social scientists, including social scientists here at Duke, are trying to understand and figure out is to what extent do you allow people to understand one another's experiences. So I have my set of experiences that shape and inform how I think about the world. But then when I begin to interact with you and I begin to see your set of experiences, those begin to help me to understand the world differently. And the things that I took for granted or the things that I assumed were the only ways to think through, my mind begins to expand and my mind begins to change. So trying to re-educate people, I don't think, right, in terms of just providing them information, I don't think it does not seem to be bearing out, at least so far what we know from the social science. But trying to provide them with different sets of experiences seem to be a promising possibility. So this is, for example, one of the reasons why some colleges have said that they're not going to allow people, freshmen, to choose their own roommates. We're going to randomly assign you because we know and believe that when you are randomly placed with people who are different from you, that then tends to change who you become and who you are, as opposed to when you get to choose to be with the same types of people that you've been with your whole entire life. It sort of reinforces a set of patterns and experiences. And so building commonality across difference and creating new types of experiences and new types of realities and new types of ways of knowing then produces different types of people. Right. And so I think that ought to be the goal. And so far, I think that seems to be the most promising direction that we're getting from the social science in terms of how to change people's views. You don't change them by trying to brainwash them. You change them by affecting their reality.
Could I jump in here? Because thank you, Guy, for setting that up, because it really echoes a lot of the engagement work that we're doing here at Duke and in Durham and beyond, which are these RX racial healing circles that I talked about before. And we make a distinction between head space work and heart space work. The individual and the interpersonal dynamics that framed this question, it's really heart space work, and that the ideologies reside in the head space, but we really want people through these circles that we call them RX racial healing circles. but they are not dialogues or conversations about race. For anyone who's experienced an ARC Spatial Healing Circle with us, you know that the diversity comes in the composition of the circle. We started out doing them face-to-face up until March. And since March, we've been doing virtual circles, trying as much as possible to replicate the intimacy and the sense of connection that people experienced in a face-to-face circle. And the idea behind it is that, so the diversity comes from the composition of the group, but then we have, there is an arc of a circle, and a very critical component of the circle are what we call the deep prompts, where we have prompts that are set up, basically for people to explore a particular challenge or moment when they had to adapt to circumstances, but rather setting up a situation when people feel like they're re-traumatized and they're revisiting a painful experience. The architecture of the prompt is set up in a particular way that people are empowered, and there is an agency component built into the prompt. But the beauty of that dyadic experience is that it's not a conversation. We're using the breakout rooms for that person. So for that purpose, we put 2 people in a breakout room, and then one person for 5 minutes will speak their truth, and the other person is simply the listener holding space for them as they're speaking their truth. And then we switch. And then we come back into a group, and a very critical component of those who want to share their story is affirmation. And why Dr. Christopher calls this ARC spatial healing is because it's not just the healing of our hearts, and the healing of our minds, it's also the healing of our bodies. That there's evidence that in being in a situation where your circumstances and your realities are affirmed, has a direct, and probably Viviana can speak, to this more eloquently than I can, but there's evidence that cortisol levels are reduced simply from, people feeling affirmed and heard, and for people holding that space. So a lot of the work that we do in terms of the engagement work that we do does kind of reside in that individual interpersonal transformation context.
Thank you so much. I will give you each a chance to just share any final thoughts before we close.
Health equity work is hard given the environment we have for us, but it shouldn't be. It should be that these type of spaces where members of different parts of our university are getting together to talk, it should happen on a more regular basis, that we are learning from each other, that we're learning from our community. The best and most important work that we can do today is to make sure that all of the members of our community are heard. In the issue of race and ethnicity in healthcare is to take the biology out of it, because there's no biology in it, but it is to take the heart into it, like Jane mentioned before, to stop seeing people as different and that potential, and creating different outcomes in the way we're treating them or engaging them. We need to really, really provide care, education. We have to live the experience of equity work, believe it, make it a personal value to make a difference.
Final thoughts on Guy and Jane?
To echo what Viviana was saying, that this work is hard work, but as she said, it shouldn't be. And so the question I pose for the audience is a reflective question, which is not to think in terms of policies and action plans and all of the important kind of institutional shifts that have to occur, for racial equity to thrive and flourish here at Duke. But for people to stop for a minute and look within, and to ask yourselves, what do I have to do as an individual? Look into your heart and say, what ways do I have to rethink my position and my investment in racial equity in order for this to be a more equitable institution for all of us? And that equity, that is slow work. That interpersonal reflection, interpersonal individual reflection is hard work. But is it necessary? You know, back to Audre Lorde, for us to dismantle these hierarchies and to find new tools, you know, for actualizing racial equity here at Duke.
One of my favorite anthems is the civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome." And it's a favorite anthem because I think it mixes the tenses. I think what it means is we have overcome, we are overcoming, and we'll continue to overcome. And I think part of what I hope people continue to take stock of is we have made a ton of progress. Look at where we are today. We are making progress, and collectively there are ways to go, and we shall still overcome. So from my perspective, though this is not a linear progress, I think it is hard fought every single step of the way, but people should be heartened by how far we have come. Yes, we have a long ways to go, but collectively as a people who have fought and have bled and cried and gotten to this point, though there's a long way to go, we are all committed. And if we continue to commit, we will continue to overcome. And that's not just an anthem, it is a promise.
Well, thank you so much for ending on that note of hope, kind of where I began. I'm thinking about, you know, as we continue dealing with these thorny, difficult, sometimes seemingly impossible questions, you know, we see there is hope. I thank you all so much for, I feel energized, and I'm going to be thinking about, you know, Jane, how we expand the circle of engagement, you know, Guy, how do we create an environment that works for everyone and reframe this conversation so that what it's about. And Viviana, really remembering that we need to hear from those people on the ground who aren't always heard and how they're being impacted. And that, you know, that's a theme that as I've been, you know, working on the anti-racism agenda to really remind myself, how do we get to that individual experience and hear from that really individualized experience? So thank you so much. Too bad I'm just going to applaud a little bit so we can hear a little applause. And thank you everybody for participating today. Also, thank you for those who presented this morning, for everyone who submitted information for their initiatives, which we will post on our website. So this concludes the breakfast. Everyone who registered will receive an evaluation email, and so please take a few minutes to fill that out so that we can have good information about what worked and what didn't work as we continue to offer this program in future years. So thank you everyone, and have a good rest of your day.